kind introduction, and thank you everyone for the invitation. I'm going to try sharing my screen in a second, and let me know if you're able to see it. Okay.
Yes, I can see your screen.
And let me try to do full screen. So are you able to see the full screen, everyone?
Yes, I am. I can be able to see it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So in this session, I'm going to be discussing AI and climate change. The way this is organized is I give a very short introduction about what is climate change exactly. I describe some of the domain areas where machine learning can help. And then I go into a few case studies about kind of specific machine learning methods and how they've been applied, in particular climate change, mitigation and adaptation problems. This is very short, right? So we won't be able to get into total detail about all the specific algorithms that are being used or all the specific problems that are being used. But I wanted to compile something like a bibliography. And I've shared these slides at this link in the bottom. So you can go there now and download these slides, and kind of maybe the most valuable thing from preparing the slides, I hope, is just having that bibliography. Here's all the kind of examples with short summaries about what they're about. So if you find one of the topics really interesting, you can go and check out the paper. If you have trouble accessing any of the papers, just send me a link or send me an email. I can probably download it through my library. I can give you the PDF if you want. And besides that, if you have questions at any point, I can't see right now whether people they raise their hands or anything like this, but just interrupt, right? I think it'd be more interesting to have a little discussion than for me to just talk about slides that you already have access to. So any kind of question or any kind of comment, just feel free to chime in. Okay, so I'll get started. So what is climate change and where does it come from? Kind of an analogy that I like to think about is you can think about the atmosphere around the Earth as kind of like a blanket, right? The atmosphere has a way of controlling how much heat stays in the Earth and how much is left out, right? So there's something, the technical term for this is radiative forcing. So when light comes in from the sun, when energy comes in from the sun, some of that energy gets absorbed, some of it gets reflected, some of it gets emitted. The balance of those different forces, this leads to either cooling or heating, right? So it's like if you had a very thin blanket around the Earth, then the Earth might cool down, right? Because a lot of the heat might get lost from the Earth. But then there's certain kinds of gases where it acts like putting extra layers on a blanket, right? It acts like making the Earth absorb more heat or more of the energy that comes to it, right? And these gases are called greenhouse gases. And what has happened over the last century and a half is that the amount of these greenhouse gases has increased. And this is mainly due to the Industrial Revolution. This is due to fossil fuel burning. So what this has caused, is kind of what had been kind of a balanced process for a long time has gotten a little bit out of balance because it's like adding new layers of blanket and then the Earth starts to heat, right? So that is kind of basic what is climate change. Okay. So here's a little bit more of a kind of technical explanation and some data about the heating process. So what this is showing on the x-axis, this is time. On the y-axis, this is global temperature, right? So not any one place, but just the estimate of temperature around the planet. And you can see the clear warming trend, right? And what these different colored bands are referring to are if we are able to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere on different time schedules, then this is the predicted change in overall temperature. And the band gives kind of an interval saying this is the worst case, this is the best case. So you can see the different emissions pathways on the right. So the first one is saying we can very quickly reduce all the emissions. And if you can very quickly reduce emissions, then you'll see this faster kind of leveling off of the overall temperature. Right? And then the last one is kind of a very gradual or no reduction in the emissions, right? And then that leads to kind of faster warming. And why does warming matter? So a lot of ecosystems, a lot of social systems depend on having a particular kind of climate, right? So this is a diagram where it's showing each bar is a different kind of impact. The y-axis is saying, suppose this is how much warming will happen. And then the color within the bar is saying, this is the expected amount of damage or risk that we expect for this particular category when there's that much warming, right? So kind of the example here is for the very first bar on the top left, RFC1, unique and threatened systems. So this is referring to things like coral reefs, specific ecosystems which can only survive at particular temperatures, right? So it's even with a little bit of warming, even half a degree of warming, there will be some impact, some risk. At 1.5 degrees of warming, then there's very high risk, right? Extreme weather events, these are things like flooding, things like wildfires. And you can see this is the gradation of risk. What I really like about this diagram is that it shows that climate change is not a on or off sort of thing. There are kind of gradations of risks that occur across many different categories, and the different categories have different levels of sensitivity. So and the bottom one breaks down the top bars in a little bit more detail. So you can see the effect on corals, fisheries, flooding, crop yield, tourism, heat, morbidity. Right? So there's, even though in the previous two slides I was showing like a very technical phenomenon, there's greenhouse effect that heats up the planet and temperatures are changing. That sounds very impersonal. Really, though, you should be thinking about these kind of downstream, these are the actual consequences. Okay. So why is there more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now than there was before, or just greenhouse gases in general now than before? Right? These are different kinds of processes that lead to higher emissions. So the overall sectors here are broken down. The one that contributes the most is electricity and heating. Right? So if we are producing electricity by burning coal, right, that releases greenhouse emissions. Transportation, kind of driving gasoline cars, that also releases emissions. But there are also, those are kind of the most common culprits, but there are lots of other processes that also release emissions. Some that can be maybe a little bit surprising. Buildings, right? Just heating buildings takes a lot of energy. Agriculture, you would think that something like agriculture would reduce carbon in the atmosphere because plants absorb carbon dioxide. But then the way that agriculture is done right now, it actually releases carbon dioxide. We'll get into this in more detail here. And what exactly does all this have to do with machine learning, right? So the point is that for each of these sectors, there are different kinds of data, and if you can use data to make these processes a little bit less carbon emitting or a little bit more carbon absorbing, then that can help tip the balance overall. So a very common misconception is people hear machine learning and climate change and they think, oh, so what, like, are you interested in looking at precipitation data or temperature data? And it's actually not just that. That's actually a very small part of the role of machine learning in addressing climate change. Really what it is you look at things like how are electricity systems currently designed? How is transportation currently set up? And are there any ways that we can, any levers that we can turn on these systems? And can we kind of do that better when we use more data? So the examples soon will hopefully clarify that. Right? But things like, you want to reduce the amount of car usage, right? So you could try to figure out some sort of machine learning system that's going to encourage, like analyze data of public transport and see if you can encourage people to take public transport. That's an example of here are the levers. Can you use data to do that, like pull that lever even further? Okay, I see some question or some chat messages. I'm not sure how to access them. Or okay, is someone able to read them out for me? Oh wait, okay, I got it. Yes, okay, thank you. I'm glad people were able to get them. Okay. So moving on. Let's look at some case studies. So I mentioned electricity demand and kind of how can we decarbonize the electricity system? That's one big problem right now. So one general approach is to try using renewable energy rather than burning fossil fuels. So if we could replace coal power plants with wind and solar, that would potentially reduce the amount of carbon emissions by a whole lot. Right? What are some of the barriers that are preventing that? And are there ways that we can use machine learning to resolve this, right? So like an example barrier is solar and wind power are variable supply generation strategies. What this means is that, you know, at nighttime, solar power plants do not produce energy, or when the wind is not blowing, the wind farms will not be producing much, right? So because of this, any kind of renewable-based system will have some sort of backup power plants, and these backup power plants will be using fossil fuels, and they'll be running to kind of create some sort of baseline for the system overall, right? Because the way energy generation works is unless you had really, really good batteries, then whatever energy you produced that's not used right now, it gets lost, right? So what it would be really, really useful here would be if you could forecast the amount of supply that's going to be available sometime in the future. And then you can adjust your backup power plants so that they're only running kind of when it's absolutely necessary, right? You could even imagine you can adjust the demand, right? If you knew exactly what the forecast schedule should be like, then you could say, okay, there's not going to be enough sunshine in this range of time. Let's try to get people to use fewer devices or not to run the very energy consuming processes during that time window. Right? Like maybe we can provide some sort of discount for people who actually run things at nighttime, something like that, right? So if you had a really good forecast, you could improve the efficiency of the energy system. And to build these sort of forecasts, there are lots of machine learning techniques. So I gave a link to one, but there are a whole bunch. Okay, another kind of general area that machine learning can help is in detecting GHG emissions. So far I showed you this diagram that's sector level, very kind of coarse estimates of where greenhouse gas emissions come from. It would be very useful if you could actually localize in time and space, saying this is exactly where the carbon dioxide or the methane emissions are coming from, right? But that's, you know, right now that's still tricky, right? People are developing sensors that allow you to start seeing, okay, like here's a picture, this is where the methane is coming. But then once you start collecting data like this, how do you actually make sense of it, right? Working with the raw sensor output is way too overwhelming. But then if you are able to use some sort of machine learning to just count or measure, this is the amount of greenhouse emissions in these different regions, then you could target your action. Okay. Reducing transportation demand. So there are a few ways that this can be done. The example I mentioned earlier is you could try to forecast transportation ridership. So if you ever have a system like a bus system where people are getting on and off, and you can put a sensor that's measuring, here's how many people are using the system at different times of the day, then you can figure out like what are the routes that you should be including that people are not, like if you had included that route, then a lot more people would be using public transport. You can try to make that kind of decision making. You can turn raw sensor images. So here's a picture of just all the trucks on roads. And if you could just understand, like, this is how much transportation is contributing or just how much emissions we think is coming from transportation across these different highways, then that gives you something to act on. But then as is, we just have satellite imagery, right? You just have the raw sensor data. To turn that raw sensor data into something that's more directly usable, that's what machine learning can be very helpful for. Okay, so now getting into the areas that aren't as obvious, but which could still have a big impact. So I mentioned like buildings and cities. If you could make more efficient buildings or do upgrades and retrofits across cities, that would also reduce emissions by a lot, right? Because it would reduce the energy demand. So kind of an example here is there have been examples where people have taken LiDAR data across entire cities, and they're able to assess, here is the different kinds of building stock. Here are their ages. Here's how much energy demand they have, right? And if you can build these sort of catalogs, then you can understand, okay, maybe we should invest government resources into upgrading these kind of buildings or into proposing this new kind of infrastructure. Right? If you could redesign cities, then that would also potentially reduce emissions by a lot. Okay. And then something that's not entirely obvious at first is that climate change is also a public health hazard. Why is this? Well, heat waves increase mortality. Also, a lot of vector-borne diseases, or kind of disease vectors, like warmer temperatures, right? So mosquitoes become more prevalent, right? So just being able to do disease surveillance effectively, or to understand where outbreaks might happen, this is the sort of thing that having good catalogs could be useful, and where machine learning can help turn just raw passive information into these more usable catalogs. So example is you could look at kind of all the raw satellite information to try to figure out what is the air pollution levels over time. That's what this picture on the right is doing. Okay. Oh, is there a question?
No, there are no questions.
Okay. Yep. Okay. So personal energy use. This is not an area I know as much, but I've heard a few people working on this, where they can try to estimate personal carbon footprints and try to guide people into decision making so that they use kind of lower energy demand strategies, right? So that's something, it's surprising that considering all the impacts of climate change, it's still relatively hard for just a person to know how much is their carbon footprint. But in theory, we do have all these digital traces everywhere. We should be able to back that out. Okay, agriculture and forestry. So why are these areas important, right? Forests are huge carbon sinks, right? So like trees absorb carbon. So deforestation is very bad for climate change. Not only does it prevent trees from absorbing in the future, it releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere when you burn trees. And this example, I'll zoom in to it. I thought it was a really interesting application. So what they're doing is they took this image of forest land and then they took it at 1 month apart, and then they look at the loss of forest cover. And by looking at the loss in the tree canopy, they're able to estimate this is the change in the carbon stock of the forest, right? So this takes kind of a very general knowledge that we have about forests and their relationship to climate change, and it makes it much more detailed, right? You're able to now say, this is where specifically we think the carbon stocks are changing, right? And this extra information is something that scientists, something that policymakers can start to act on, right? But the data don't exist yet. And supply chain management. So here's a kind of a sad but true story about these shellfish on the right here. They were fished off of the coast of England. They were flown all the way to Southeast Asia to be peeled. And then they were shipped back to England to be sold in the supermarket, right? This shipping by airplane, that's extremely, it releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. The reason it was done is because it's cheaper. The labor cost is so much cheaper in Asia than in England. But then if you had actually accounted for the carbon cost of all that transport, then it makes no sense, right? So the trouble is we don't have a very clear understanding of all these kinds of supply chains, and we don't understand exactly what their carbon footprints are, right? So even compiling better data about supply chains and how we might be able to shorten them or reduce their carbon footprint, that is also a very big lever that we could be taking advantage of. Okay, so that is kind of the overall case studies. I wasn't talking about any specific machine learning algorithms. Maybe you're interested in particular technologies, right? Maybe like you've come to the Indaba, you've learned about a specific kind of computer vision or a specific kind of text data. You want to see, is there any way that I can use this knowledge to do something about climate change, right? So I'll try explaining a few examples that have been done before and maybe give some inspiration for things in the future. So for computer vision, there are a lot of examples where you get some raw imagery, and what you really would like from that raw imagery is some sort of count that would be useful for downstream knowledge, right? So an example on the bottom right, the raw imagery, these are just the tops of building homes from satellite images. But the knowledge that you would really like to have is, this is the coverage of solar panels across homes, across some place, right? So there is no central database of here's all the solar panels in the country, right? Or in the world. But then you can go through these images and you can just build an algorithm that will scan through the images and find all these little solar panels and then add up the areas. Right? So this is kind of an amazing example. Yeah, I just think that you could scan through much more area than any one person could ever do. So in text data and NLP, so climate change and climate change research is a very large area now, right? And every few years, there's a panel on climate change that's convened by the UN, and they try to make sense of that growing literature. Right? But this gets harder and harder as there's more and more literature about climate change. Right? So something people have tried to do is, can you build a map of all the literature out there? And can you make the map based on just the raw text from all these reports? Right, so this is the example on the right. Each of these dots is a different scientific paper. And these little clusters are different scientific literature areas where everyone here is studying kind of maybe kind of effective crisis or crisis management in climate change. And maybe everyone in the other cluster is thinking about energy system changes or energy resilience for climate change, right? So it just gives a global view of many, many more papers than any one person would ever be able to read. Okay, for time series, this can be useful both at short term and long term. So in the short term, there are problems like the building HVAC, like AC and heating prediction problem. There's problems like energy supply and demand prediction. In the longer run, there are questions about how is the climate system changing, right? If we have certain change in temperature, if we have kind of certain carbon emission pathways, what would be the climate system that you would anticipate 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And then reinforcement learning and control. So maybe the most famous example of this was the data centers at DeepMind and Google. So usually there's some kind of baseline algorithm to manage the consumption of these data centers, the energy consumption of these data centers. But then if you use a reinforcement learning algorithm instead, then the power use goes down pretty noticeably. That's what this figure on the left is. Right? So this machine learning algorithm is better able to manage this than any person or any kind of standard algorithm is able to do. And then unsupervised and transfer learning. Okay, so there are a fair number of situations here where there is not any automatic label. The trouble is, compared to internet applications, right? In a lot of internet applications, you're basing data off of how people interact with apps. And whenever people are interacting with apps, you're getting labels, right? Like if someone likes a post or follows an account, that's like a label that you can use in a machine learning algorithm. But then for climate change, we need to have machine learning algorithms in the real world, right? And the real world doesn't come to you with labels. So instead, we have all these raw sensor measurements, right? Like his example is all these just imagery of the Earth. And then if you want to start annotating it, you need to start from basically zero labels, right? Or you have to come up with some sort of proxy and make some sense from that proxy. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap up in a couple minutes now. So kind of a few overall themes. Accelerated experimentation. Right? So if you can help people do their science better, if there are people who are already working on technologies that are very relevant for climate change, machine learning and the data that are produced by machine learning algorithms as outputs, these could be very useful for accelerating that experiments. I've showed a few examples with satellite imagery. This is kind of the technical term for this is remote sensing data. These are useful in a lot of climate change applications. Okay, improving efficiency, so that's like the supply chain examples. So things that are already done, but if you could make it less carbon intensive, that would be helpful. Approximating intensive simulations. So kind of this is related to the kind of forecasting problem. So a lot of forecasting is based on simulation. If you can do this a little bit more efficiently, that would be key. And then finally, to have these models be more interpretable and less black box, right? This is important because these are applications in the real world. These are not just things on computers anymore, right? So using something completely black box is no longer acceptable. Okay. I feel like this is maybe, yeah, this is the sort of thing that's not clear for people who are too focused on machine learning, but I think the Indaba has always done a very good job about thinking about the overall context of technology, right? So just because something sounds cool, sounds like cool data, doesn't mean it will be useful, right? So it's really key to have domain expert collaborations. Machine learners aren't going to swoop in and fix climate change. There have been communities working on this for decades. It's important to be literate and trying to understand exactly what has been going on before machine learning. Okay, and if you find this sort of topic interesting, here are kind of the overall, like what has to be done, right? So learn, just try to build your foundation and what are different kinds of technologies that have been used so far, what are different applications that are important. Find collaborators. They're actually, you now have skills that are, a lot of people find this very useful, right? So if you can kind of get experience looking at real world data, working with people, understanding exactly how what they're doing can help, right? Don't try to do this on your own. And then finally deploy, right? It's really not enough to just have a prototype. It might inspire other people, but really in the long run, the thing that's important is that carbon in the atmosphere goes away or reduce. Okay, and just some final resources. Climatechange.ai. This was a group that I used to be a part of. They do a lot of really neat workshop organizing. They release a lot of materials for free on the internet. They have a newsletter, they have a discussion forum. This is where most of the examples I got in this lecture, I just got by skimming through the materials on this website. yeah, here's the discussion forum. There are people with PhDs in energy and agriculture and transportation and machine learning, and they're all just discussing things on this forum. So if you have questions, if you are interested in certain kinds of projects, this is a really great resource. People just are sharing ideas with each other. Okay, and I mentioned they have lots of materials online. You can watch entire workshops just on this. And that's all. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kris, for this amazing session. So far, there are no questions, but in case anyone has any question, any query, something that didn't make sense to you, you feel free to ask. Well, it looks like there are no questions for you. I would like to hand over the mic to Eugene.
Thank you, Samiha. Thank you so much, Dr. Sankaran, for that presentation. We really appreciate AI for social good. Okay, now we had a question and Pascal had gone out. Pascal, there was a question from Dawit and he was asking, are there any known mechanisms to check deep fake information?
Yes, I already replied by mail. The thing that the best would be, I mean, I invite anyone if you want to, if they want to read more about, because I get a lot of interesting resources article about, because definitely really need to be like expert in not only machine learning domain, and but if we just want to cover, just want to list, I mean, solution that exists in the market. Definitely you should read about Microsoft. I mean, Microsoft deploy like deep fake detector. That seems to be like, I mean, promising, even though it's still complicated. And when I explained on the last email, the thing that it's definitely complicated task in the sense that the variety, and especially the how, for example, the deep fake can be, I mean, so sophisticated. As I explained in my mail, I mean, just um, want to cover about the Tom Cruise deepfakes. And the thing is that even for anyone, any data scientist, if you look at that, you would just notice that it's just impossible, I mean, to detect. And that's why, I mean, they're using, I mean, especially interesting tool and most sophisticated, they are using, start to using like complicated, very sophisticated technique to fight this. And I'm going to provide you the link because I need to be much more specialist in the domain, and it goes, I would say, beyond, I mean, much beyond the simple machine learning and AI technique.
Okay, thank you very much, Pascal. Hopefully that suffices for Dawit. Rose, I saw you with a question for Dr. Sankaran, is it? Rose?
Yes, I'm seeking for clarity. Thank you, Dr. Sankaran, for such an amazing talk. I was particularly interested in the talk about climate change and how to detect carbon emission. Yes, it's one of the effects that is happening apparently, causing and leading to global warming as an effect, and it raises much concern. In your submission, you talked about looking at examples like satellite imagery, where we look at the canopy cover and then detect. But then I was more interested in understanding how this is correlated to understanding the carbon emission. What kind of measures or what kind of features are used to correlate satellite imagery in terms of canopy cover? And how do you relate that to carbon emission scientifically? It raised my inquiry. Thank you.
Okay, no, this is an interesting question, right? This is almost like the question of where does the labeled data come from if you're just throwing in all these satellite images of forests, right? How do you know what exactly the carbon stored in those trees is, right? as far as I understand, it's actually relatively rough calculation, right? People just, they can look at individual trees and try to understand what is the chemical composition of that tree. And then you can estimate how much carbon is in this tree, and then people just extrapolate. So they'll do things like they'll just try to understand what is the radius of all the different tree trunks, what are their heights, and then you kind of get a guess about the overall volume of the forest. And then this is where you get these estimates for carbon stock. I think the question's also getting a little bit into kind of like that's just a number. How does that number relate to climate change, right? I think the key is something like the key is thinking about just thinking about how does carbon cycle throughout all these different ecosystems. Ideally, there would be more carbon in the ground right now than in the atmosphere. Right? For millennia, carbon has going in and out of the ground and the atmosphere, and things have just been tipping a little bit more towards the atmosphere recently because of all the burning that has been happening. Does that make sense? Is there any follow-up question?
Yes, it does. Thanks very much for the response.
Okay.